On the 12th of January 1888, after weeks of harsh cold, the morning dawned warm and bright over Willow Field in the Dakota Territory. The settlers were grateful, as temperatures had barely climbed above freezing for what seemed an eternity. Fences were buried under snowdrifts, and even the strongest spirits were worn down. But that Thursday seemed like a blessing. At dawn, the thermometer outside Doyle Pickett's land office showed 43 degrees Fahrenheit, and by 9 a.m. it had risen above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. After being confined for weeks, children headed to school in light jackets, some without any coat. Farmers ventured out to inspect their animals. Women flung their doors wide, allowing the crisp January breeze to flow through rooms that had become stuffy. It was as if the entire prairie exhaled. Except for Niels Bergstrom, nobody observed the slender blue line on the northwest horizon. He was standing in the doorway of the huge sawmill building that the townspeople referred to as the grave. The structure spread out like an old earthwork, located half a mile north of the settlement. However, Niels wasn't watching his own building. He observed the sky. The blue streak became thicker and rose higher. Yet it wasn't a cloud. It was a barrier, a wall of freezing air so dense and fierce that it was visible from roughly 50 miles away. A shifting drape of black, blue, and white consumed the sky as it advanced. Niels had witnessed this phenomenon once earlier, during his childhood on the Norwegian coast. A polar tempest had descended from the Arctic, claiming the lives of 30 fishermen in a single afternoon. The elders of his village referred to it as a death wind. He pivoted and went back inside. "Ingrid," he said in a low voice, "bring the children and every single one of them right now." Ingrid Bergstrom didn't question him. 14 years of marriage had shown her that her husband wasn't easily frightened. When he used that quiet, monotone voice, emptied of all emotion except determination, a dreadful event was imminent. What set Niels Bergstrom apart, making him so ready for a storm that tricked everybody else? Niels Bergstrom came to the Dakota Territory in the spring of 1882, age 30. Niels was among the many Scandinavian settlers who traveled to the northern plains seeking property and opportunity. He was raised on Norway's coast, the child of a fisherman in a rocky landscape. Tempest and ocean, he understood cold not as a concept but as an animate power, one that required reverence. A power that could take your life if you didn't treat it with proper gravity. The Dakota Territory was level with few trees, whereas Norway had mountains and was blanketed with forests. Dakota lay exposed to the elements. Norway offered shelter through its fjords and valleys. Yet the chill in Dakota seemed recognizable. The winter gales shrieked over the prairie, bearing the same deadly purpose as the storms that roared over the North Atlantic. Niels understood this with the certainty of someone who had nearly died from freezing at the age of 16. He realized that the Dakota Territory settlers were woefully unprepared for the true nature of winter there. He filed his claim on about 161 acres of barren prairie immediately north of Willow Field. The filing cost was $14. The earth was fertile, dark, and rich, ideal for growing wheat and flax. However, Niels was most fascinated by the gentle hill at the center of his property. The spot served as a natural windbreak, a gentle rise that drained water and offered a stable foundation. Ever since his journey from Christiania, he had envisioned a building, and this location was perfect. He would construct a longhouse. This would be nothing like the weak timber huts that American pioneers erected in a single season. Those had slender plank walls with cracks that let the wind howl through. Nor was it like the typical sodus. The more sensible settlers constructed their sodus with walls 1 to 2 feet thick and roofs that dripped mud during every storm. Niels intended to build something his Viking forefathers would recognize. Right from the initial stone, this structure was engineered to withstand the harshest elements nature could unleash. Niels personally cut the sod with a breaking plow, carving the resilient prairie grass into consistent blocks. Each brick measured roughly 24 inches in length, 12 inches in width, and 4 inches in thickness, weighing close to 51 pounds. He arranged them in staggered rows, much like a stonemason laying stone. The walls eventually became about 3 feet thick. At the foundation, his blue roan gelding named Slate dragged cottonwood logs from the bed of a nearby creek. 5 miles distant, Niels selected trees based on their straightness and durability. He removed their bark to prevent decay. The building process required 2 full years. His brother Peter initially assisted with the labor-intensive tasks, but later succumbed to diphtheria. Niels persisted on his own. He got up before sunrise and labored until it was too dark to see his own hands. As the light diminished, Ingrid prepared the mortar, a blend of clay, grass, and water, and filled the gaps between the rows. With the consistent competence she applied to all tasks, the children hauled water, collected grass, and arranged the seemingly unending bricks. The residents of Willowfield observed Niels's efforts with a combination of amazement and sympathy. Doyle Pickett, the local land agent, was the initial person to voice an opinion. Pickett had prospered by selling property and operating the general store on credit. Dressed in an elegant coat and a bowler hat, he moved with the relaxed self-assurance of a man controlling the town's finances. One Saturday afternoon in his bustling shop, Pickett announced that Norwegian is constructing a fort. The walls were roughly 3 feet thick, and the structure measured about 79 feet in length for a household of 6. He slowly shook his head, a display of exaggerated disbelief. I figure he's anticipating a conflict with the Indians, or perhaps he's constructing his own burial vault, hard to distinguish between the two. The nickname caught on right away. Everyone referred to it as the grave. Bergstrom's grave turned into a typical salutation. Have you laid eyes on the grave yet? The Norwegian keeps on digging himself deeper. People believe he'll eventually cover himself with soil. By Christmas, even Mayor Lyle Holt, a prudent individual who had Pickett to thank for his role, expressed his worries. The sheer scale of it is improper. He remarked, "It indicates a person who lacks faith in his neighbors, one who anticipates the worst from his community. Such an individual does not make a good citizen." The ladies of Willowfield were equally critical as Mrs. Pickett. She formed welcoming committees for each new settler, but overlooked the Bergstroms, claiming they preferred solitude. She justified, "They talk in that foreign tongue, and that structure, it's not Christian. It's heathen, akin to what ancient pagans might have erected." Ingrid caught the murmurs while she visited town for provisions, and by that time, she comprehended English quite adequately. Terms such as grave, tomb, heathen, and insane reached her hearing. She relayed them to Niels with no display of feeling. Niels placed another sod brick in position. "Let them chatter," he remarked. "Words can't block the wind." In spite of mockery, how did this heathen oddity hold up against the harsh truth of a Dakota winter? Come fall of 1884, the longhouse was complete, and nothing else on the Dakota prairie resembled it. The main hall stretched approximately 39 feet in length and 29 feet in width. Its ceiling reached nearly 10 feet at its peak, supported by cottonwood beams as thick as a man's thigh. At both ends were 2 enormous stone fireplaces. Niels constructed them from fieldstone transported roughly 3 miles from a glacial deposit. He joined the stones using lime mortar, which he produced himself by burning limestone gathered from the open prairie. The floor consisted of compacted earth, as firm as brick. Ingrid and Ragnar covered sections of it with woven grass mats crafted during the lengthy winter nights. The walls formed the core of the design. The walls were about 35 inches thick, composed of packed sod externally. On the interior, Niels applied a coat of whitewashed plaster, a lime and sand mixture he had learned to create. These enormous walls absorbed warmth from the fireplaces and gradually emitted it, maintaining a consistently warm interior. Thin-walled timber houses were incapable of such performance. During summer, those same massive walls kept the inside cool. The roof was cut, angled, and drained correctly, providing an additional insulating layer. The whole structure adapted to the seasons, remaining warm in winter and cool in summer. The stable wing, always steady, accommodated the slate and the 2 family milk cows. Their body heat further warmed the building. Under the main hall, a sturdy trapdoor led to a root cellar. It stored potatoes, turnips, dried fish, salt, pork, and grain. This supply was sufficient to sustain the family for months without requiring a trip to town for provisions. The entire expense, including the filing fee, tools, and the limited items he couldn't craft or forage, amounted to $97 the following winter. The winter of 1884, 1885 was severe. The subsequent 1885, 1886 proved even more brutal, followed by the winter of 1886-1887. Folks referred to it as the Great Die-Up. It was catastrophic. Across the northern plains, millions of cattle perished from the cold. Settlers in their flimsy walled shacks lacked any protection, and families incinerated everything they owned: furnishings, fences, wagon platforms, anything combustible. They struggled to endure weeks of -40-degree temperatures. It was a grim battle, and many perished. Yet the Bergstrom longhouse remained steadfast, its massive walls effortlessly deflecting the roaring winds. The fireplaces, fueled by a modest quantity of cottonwood and dried buffalo chips, maintained adequate interior warmth. Provisions were retrieved from the root cellar, and the stable preserved the livestock. A dozen individuals, among them 4 children under age 10, endured the harshest winter in Dakota's history in relative comfort. Willowfield observed the longhouse's endurance, but the lesson was not heeded. Upon the eventual arrival of spring, the deceased cattle were tallied, and the frozen settlers were interred. The town rebuilt in their customary manner: thin walls, shallow foundations. They were hopeful, trusting that the previous year's catastrophe would not recur. Once more, Niels observed them, but he remained silent. He realized that people only absorb what they prefer to believe. The severe insights of winter, he recognized, were rapidly dismissed at the first hint of spring warmth. Thus, he continued his preparations. He piled extra logs, expanded the underground storage, and strengthened the ceiling supports. His readiness wasn't for a typical winter. It was for the season that would ultimately show Willowfield the truth he already possessed. On the morning of the 12th of January, 1888, the day began mild and sunny, resembling spring, yet Niels Bergstrom sensed it was a deception. He observed the horizon turning gloomy, a slender blue streak expanding in the northwestern sky. That wasn't merely a cloud, it was a swift, moving barrier of frigid air. This was no ordinary storm. It would become known historically as the Schoolhouse Blizzard. A huge Arctic air mass at 40 degrees below zero collided with the abnormally warm air that had deceived the plains into a premature spring. This impact produced a storm of sudden, catastrophic fury at approximately 2 p.m. When that frigid barrier struck, the temperature dropped by 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Within a quarter of an hour, the gentle southerly breeze abruptly shifted direction and burst fiercely from the northwest. At nearly 60 miles per hour, snow wasn't descending. It was swept off the earth and propelled sideways with sandblasting intensity. Visibility fell to nothing in seconds. A man couldn't see his hand before his eyes, and a child couldn't spot the schoolhouse entrance. With visibility limited to just 10 feet, the blizzard caught hundreds of thousands of people in the open across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Kansas. Farmers were working their fields, travelers were journeying on the roads, and ranchers were inspecting their livestock. Most tragically, the children who had been sent to school that morning dressed in thin coats were caught. The teachers were confronted with a terrible decision: either keep the children in fragile schoolrooms that were already cooling rapidly, or release them into a blizzard that would prove deadly within minutes. In Willowfield, the school was located on the southern outskirts of town. It was a basic wooden structure with walls only about 4 inches thick. Teacher Adeline Marsh, age 23, was responsible for 26 children when the blizzard hit. The structure trembled as though struck by a train. The windows shattered, and the stove, though blazing hot all morning, suddenly seemed as ineffective as a small candle in a large cathedral. The indoor temperature plunged rapidly, and despite her youth, Miss Marsh was no fool. She understood that the schoolhouse offered no real protection. She realized that the children could not endure a trek through the blizzard to reach their homes, which were spread out miles apart across the prairie. What she needed was genuine refuge, something sturdy enough to withstand the storm. Then, an idea struck her: the grave. The question remained: how could Mills possibly bring them to his far-off, ridiculed grave while the storm raged and the children were trapped? Subscribe to see the proof that arrives shortly. It's not what she expected. Niels had already been on the move. Having noticed the horizon grow dark, he dispatched Ingrid and Ragnar to prepare the longhouse, light both fires, fetch water, and retrieve provisions from the underground storage. Next, he saddled his elderly horse, Slate, and headed south towards the town. The gale was already forceful enough to knock a man down. He arrived at the schoolhouse at exactly 2 p.m., just as the blizzard struck with maximum intensity. Inside, Miss Marsh had gathered the children into a tight group in the center of the room. The children were bundled in every available coat and blanket, singing religious songs to maintain their morale. The walls trembled, and the door bent inward due to the wind's force. Niels skipped pleasantries. "You can't remain here," he yelled above the noise. "This structure won't survive. My house lies half a mile to the north. We need to leave immediately while we still can." "Half a mile?" Miss Marsh looked at him in disbelief. "In this weather," she said, "the children will be lost within moments." "I've got rope," Niels replied. 200 feet of it wrapped around Slate's saddle. "We'll tie the children together. They'll grip the rope, while I take the lead and you bring up the rear. No one must let go." No one. He stated a crazy plan, but it was all they had. Yet it remained their sole option. So they paired the children up, tying them together. Each pair consisted of an older and a younger child, linked to the main rope with a short tether. Niels positioned himself at the front, the rope's end fastened around his waist, one hand gripping Slate's bridle as he leaned into the storm. Miss Marsh occupied the back, the rope's other end tied securely around her waist. She counted the children by touch, unable to see beyond the child immediately ahead. They ventured into the snowstorm, and the cold struck them as if it were a tangible force. The children cried out, but the wind snatched their voices away. The snow wasn't descending, it was racing sideways, a white abyss that obliterated everything. Niels was completely blind. He navigated by instinct alone, feeling the ground's incline beneath his boots and the wind's angle on his cheeks. Slate trudged onward, head lowered, the elderly horse placing unconditional trust in his master, a loyalty forged through earlier tempests. They needed 40 minutes to traverse that half-mile, 40 minutes of gusts that made them stumble. A frozen, painful advance across a void with no points of reference, no visible horizon, no compassion. On 2 occasions, a child toppled and had to be pulled back up via the rope. Once the entire column halted, a 6-year-old called Freddie Hall, the mayor's youngest child, had crumpled to the ground and was unable to get up. Niels passed Slate's reins to the eldest boy, walked back down the line, hoisted Freddie onto his shoulders, and pressed onward. They arrived at the longhouse at 3:10 the afternoon. The heavy door swung open and heat flooded into the storm, feeling like a benediction. Ingrid and Ragnar hurried the children inside, snipped the ropes, removed their ice-covered clothes, bundled their little frames in blankets, and gave warm cups to their frozen fingers. The central room, with its roaring fires and 3-foot-thick walls, seemed a different universe. Calm, heated, secure. The blizzard lashed the turf, but achieved nothing. All 26 children and 1 teacher survived. Niels had rescued all 26 kids, guiding them through a tempest that ought to have been fatal. But his work wasn't over. He rested 10 minutes, sipped some hot coffee, then ventured back into the blinding white darkness. Willowfield Town was perishing. The fragile wood structures, constructed in rapid optimism for prosperous days, were collapsing. Windows shattered, doors caved inward, walls fractured and splintered under the unending assault of the wind. Families that had begun the day in light jackets now endured temperatures of 22 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Only low-quality timber, never designed to withstand such force, separated them from death. That afternoon and evening, Niels undertook 4 additional journeys into the blizzard. Each time, he retraced a rope line he had set up between his longhouse and the town's perimeter. He rescued families, the Holts, the Sorensens, the Webbers, the Marshalls, and also discovered elderly Elias Poyet. The blacksmith was holding onto his anvil in a workshop that had lost its roof. Niels carried out Doyle Pickett's wife and their 3 children, but Pickett himself insisted on staying in his store. The front wall gave way, leaving him no option by midnight. Inside the Bergstrom longhouse, 71 individuals were crammed, 71 souls in a structure designed for only 12. The main hall was packed so tightly there was barely space to stand. Children lay in overlapping rows on the ground, wrapped in all the blankets, coats, and fabric scraps the family possessed. Adults rotated shifts at the hearths, stoking the fires to maintain a constant warmth. The stable wing sheltered not only Slate and the dairy cows, but also 11 additional horses and a pair of mules. The refugees brought with them a cramped, uncomfortable, noisy atmosphere reeking of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and terror. Yet the walls, made of nearly 3 feet of compacted sod which Willowfield had ridiculed for 4 years, withstood and defied the hurricane-force gusts. The stone fireplaces, crafted by a man who knew fire was never a luxury but an absolute need, remained unmoved. They kept a steady blaze all through the night. Everyone was fed from the root cellar. The longhouse, that so-called pagan monstrosity, that grave, that tomb, performed precisely the function Niels Bergstrom had designed it for. The longhouse withstood the blizzard, which howled fiercely for 18 hours. When it finally ceased on the morning of January 13th, those still alive emerged from the longhouse into a landscape scoured bare by the wind. Snow accumulation was minimal because the wind was too powerful to allow drifts. But the cold was unearthly. Any exposed skin turned numb in under a minute, and the very air felt brittle enough to split. What sight would greet them when they turned toward Willowfield, and how would this ordeal reshape their view of Neil and his burial site? When the storm finally subsided on the morning of January 13th, the survivors exited the longhouse into a world wiped clean. Gazing south at Willowfield stunned them into silence. The town lay in ruins, roofs torn off, walls collapsed. The schoolhouse, where only the day before 26 children had sung hymns, was now a heap of shattered timber, its stove buried beneath wreckage. Had Miss Marsh insisted the children stay, they would have been crushed, frozen to death, or suffered both fates. Doyle Pickett's general store had its entire front wall gone. Flour, coffee, fabric bolts, tools, tobacco, all were strewn across the frozen prairie, giving the scene the appearance of a shipwreck. Mayor Holt's residence was in nearly as bad a shape. His family lived only because the Niels had fetched them. The mayor's youngest son, Freddie, the boy who had collapsed during the march, was sleeping soundly in the longhouse. His stomach was full of warm broth, and a healthy color had come back to his face. Throughout the northern plains, the toll was heartbreaking. The Schoolhouse Blizzard claimed 235 lives. A large number were children, youngsters who had been sent to school in thin coats on what started as a warm morning. Children whose teachers faced an impossible decision and sent them into the storm. Children discovered frozen, solid mere steps from the doorways of their own homes. Yet in Willowfield, no one perished. All 71 people came through alive inside the structure they had once labeled a tomb. The community convened 3 days afterward. The temperature had moderated enough that people could talk without their breath turning to ice. Because no other building in Willowfield was big enough or remained upright, they gathered in the longhouse. Doyle Pickett requested the first word, rising before the crowd wearing borrowed garments. His personal clothing was strewn over a quarter-mile of icy plains, his broadcloth coat missing. His bowler hat vanished, along with the relaxed confidence he used to project. In its place stood something unpolished and incomplete. He spoke with a rough voice, saying, 4 years ago, I was in my store. He referred to the building as a grave and claimed Niels Bergstrom was constructing his own tomb. I told that joke, and the entire town joined in laughter. We kept laughing as this man constructed the sole building in Willowfield capable of withstanding what we just endured. He paused, moving his jaw without any sound for a while. My children, wife, and I are all alive, thanks to this building. Yet I spent 4 years ridiculing the man who made that possible. Addressing Niels Bergstrom, he admitted, I was a conceited and foolish individual. I mocked things beyond my comprehension and urged others to join in. You had no obligation to me or this town, yet you entered that storm on 5 occasions, each time guiding us to safety. He lowered his head. I cannot find adequate words for your deeds. All I can express is my mistake, my gratitude, and my commitment to earn what you provided for the remainder of my life. Mayor Holt stood up next, his voice trembling, not due to cold. Freddie, my son, would have died, he stated plainly, stuck on the prairie halfway between the schoolhouse and a house that couldn't have saved him. Mr. Bergstrom hauled my child on his back across a tempest that could have ended a full-grown man. He dabbed his eyes with the back of his hand. I labeled this structure inappropriate. I cast doubt on the builder's integrity. I acted foolishly, and that stupidity almost lost me my son. Then Miss Marsh addressed. The teacher, whose bravery equaled Niels during the storm, addressed the gathering. Her serene demeanor resembled that of someone who confronted death and deemed it insufficient. "I had 26 kids in my custody," she recounted. "When the storm struck, 26 children were in a flimsy schoolhouse. I could only give them songs and optimism. Mr. Bergstrom gave them something superior, sturdy walls. At last, the townspeople grasped it. Yet what were Niels's personal beliefs, and how would this incident permanently shape Willowfield?" After the addresses concluded, Niels Bergstrom rose gradually. He was seated on a chair hidden in the corner, distant from the audience. He wasn't someone fond of public speaking. His accent retained a Norwegian flavor, and he chose his words meticulously, like a craftsman constructing durable items. "In Norway," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "there's a term, dugad." He halted, allowing the unfamiliar word to linger. "It denotes collaborative labor for everyone's benefit." He glanced across the room. "I didn't construct this house alone." He spoke of his brother Peter, who had set the initial stones before his death. He mentioned his spouse Ingrid and sister Ragnar, who blended the mortar. He noted his children, who hauled water until their arms were sore. Everyone contributed. He explained the reason for the wall's thickness. He claimed to understand winter's fury. He'd witnessed death and felt its chokehold. Referring to the prairie wind, he noted that building lightly places faith in the weather's benevolence. Weather isn't kind, nor is it cruel. It just exists, and construction must adapt. He then surveyed the onlooking crowd. He declared, "This house welcomes you. It always has." Walls don't recall who ridiculed them. They simply stand firm. It required 2 years to reconstruct Willowfield. The community that emerged from the snow was transformed. Under Niels' direction, 17 sod structures were erected, all featuring sturdy walls and foundations, as demonstrated by the longhouse. Wooden homes had sod stacked against their outer walls. Each residence now possessed a deep root cellar. Willowfield would no longer be vulnerable between the gale and a hope. Doyle Pickett's new store had walls 17.7 inches thick. Though it cost double the original, he never grumbled about the expense. He also offered rope in 98, 4-foot coils. Thereafter, each household in Willowfield possessed a safety line, a rope linking their home to their barn. Adeline Marsh continued teaching at Willowfield for 12 more years. She wed a rancher in 19, but never lost memory of that 40-minute blizzard walk. She retained a segment of the rope. That identical rope, which once linked 26 children to survival, remained in a glass display on her mantelpiece till her passing. The expression "building like Bergstrom" quickly circulated among Dakota communities. It signified constructing for extreme circumstances, not merely average ones. It meant honoring winter's strength rather than just enduring it. Folks uttered the phrase with the profound comprehension of those who had grasped its significance. Niels and Ingrid Bergstrom raised their offspring in that longhouse the difficult way. Their grandchildren also matured within those walls. The building endured for 63 years before being demolished in 1947 to accommodate a contemporary farmhouse. By that time, the earth walls had become as strong as concrete. The wrecking crew reported that the construction resisted demolition with the same tenacity as its builder. Nowadays, a modest stone monument marks the site where the longhouse formerly stood. The grandchildren of the 71 survivors set it in place. They assembled on the centennial of the storm to recall the events and pay tribute to the man who rescued them. The engraving appears in 2 tongues. In English it says, "Here stood the house that held." Below it, in Norwegian, there are 3 words. "Vegans store the wall stands." Niels would have favored the Norwegian version. The 12th of January, 1888, dawned mild and bright across Dakota Territory. That misleading tranquility was countered by the lasting impact of a man who looked beyond it and constructed for genuine endurance. The true gauge of intelligence lies not in anticipating typical weather patterns. It resides in readiness for catastrophic extremes. Subscribe if narratives like this appeal to you. Every couple of weeks, I stumble upon one of these and post a comment. Which ancient method do you suppose we've overlooked that still serves a purpose no one has recognized yet?